I'm Neil Paterson, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, we are talking prisoners, and very specifically, IPP prisoners. IPP, well, that stands for Imprisonment for Public Protection. Under an IPP sentence, a prisoner would serve a tariff set by the judge, but would only be released after that time's been served if a parole board approved it. So, in essence, some prisoners are being held indefinitely, despite having served the tariff set by the court. Now, that might strike you as somewhat unfair, which is why IPP sentences were abolished back in 2012. Despite that, there are thousands of people still behind bars on IPPs. They have no idea when they'll be released, which is why the UN has described it as psychological torture, and why there are politicians advocating for something to be done about those IPP prisoners. Joining us in the studio, Sky correspondent Alice Porter, who's been following the latest developments in the story. Alongside her, Anthony Hipkiss, who was released from prison in February and who served 16 years on an IPP sentence.
I've got to a position where I'm sat in a 15-foot concrete box saying, well, I'm never going to get released.
Good to have you both in. And Anthony, I hope you don't mind if I just immediately turn to Alice for a little bit of explanation. IPPs, where did they come from and who are they supposed to be targeting?
Well, IPPs were supposed to be given to offenders whose crimes didn't warrant a whole life sentence. So often pretty serious criminals were given these sentences. And I suppose the advantage of them was that it allowed the prison system to make sure somebody would go away for a minimum period of time, but it would also allow them to analyse how someone's behaviour is in prison and to make sure that they've done a certain number of courses, that they've been well rehabilitated before they are integrated back into society. And there have been some very serious criminals out there who've been on IPP. So, for example, John Warboys, the black cab taxi rapist, he was on an IPP sentence. And, many would argue that was an appropriate sentence. He may have ended up in prison longer than had he not been given an IPP sentence. But they were, in many cases, given to people who had committed relatively low-level crimes.
So on the one hand, incredibly serious offences, and you want to make sure that they are ready to be put back into the community. On the other hand, recidivist offenders, repeat offenders who are particularly doing the same crime over and over and over again, they don't get out unless they can prove that they're ready to be back out.
Yeah, so they were given out just far more widely than initially anticipated. And they were brought in under David Blunkett when he was Home Secretary, and there just perhaps wasn't the foresight to see how it could have played out. And I think perhaps there was perhaps not the awareness of the unintended consequences. And that's something he's talked about. And he said that this has been an enormous regret to him in his career.
What does a prisoner on an IPP sentence have to do to get out once they have served that minimum tariff?
They have to go through a number of rehabilitative courses. And some of these are available in some prisons. Sometimes they're not, and sometimes they're oversubscribed. And we've heard from family members who say some prisoners are physically fighting to get access to these courses in order to prove to the parole board that they're safe to be rehabilitated into society.
Anthony, tell us your story. What was the crime for which you were convicted?
I was convicted of threats to kill in 2007.
So a very serious offence?
Yeah, it's an offence, but in the overall scheme of offending, it's actually quite a low-ranking offence.
It may well be in terms of the sentencing tariff, but I'm wondering if people sitting at home hearing that you were convicted on, threats to kill would suggest it was anything other than a serious offence.
Oh, of course. I speak quite regularly about the impact it had on the victims, of course, and we always have to keep them centre in our thoughts. But in terms of if she was to get threats to kill today, you'd probably only get 4 years. What's hard is when you see someone who actually commits a murder, actually takes a life. I've known murderers served less time than I did.
As indeed have I. What was the minimum tariff that you were given?
15 months.
15 months?
Yeah.
And you end up serving?
16 years.
How on earth is that possible?
Exactly. This is the disgrace of the IPP. So it was originally designed for terrorists and sex offenders, so we just thought you could keep them indefinitely, like Alice said, till they've proven themselves no longer a threat to the public. So
you served your 15 months. What happened next at that point? Because that's the point at which you would have been permitted to see the parole board.
As with everything in prison, there's a huge backlog. They're easily 7 months behind at the moment, parole boards. I've known them be up to several years behind at one point.
You didn't get to see the parole board for 4 years after you'd served the 15?
For 4 years originally.
Right.
So 2011 was the first time I went before a parole board. Again, just backlogs, and they can reject a board behind the scenes. They
Uh-huh.
can look at it and go, no, this guy's not ready yet, which I think is unfair because I've not been on there to represent myself.
Uh-huh.
So I was getting rejected by what they call a one-man panel member. They'll say, well, he's not done this course, so we need to get him on this course. But the problem is there's probably 10 spaces to every 100 prisoners.
Is there not priority given to IPP prisoners?
They've just started being prioritised. Because no one knew what this was about at the beginning and no one knew what to do with us, we got put at back at pile. Because you had short-term offenders coming in, say, serving 6 months to a couple of years. So, the system wanted to get them because they know they're going to get released no matter what. Where they thought, well, we've got these guys indefinitely, we can catch up with them when we've got the space. So, it was really, really like Alice said, you was fighting, pleading to get on courses.
What affected this discontinued incarceration and not knowing when you were going to get out? What affected that having?
I've attempted suicide 3 times. I've got to a position where I'm sat in a 15-foot concrete box saying, well, I'm never going to get released. I got to a point where, particularly around about 2008, between 2008 and 2012, I was just like, I'm never getting out. I don't want to continue living here.
A 4-year period.
Yeah, it was horrendous, where I just thought, this is not happening. 85 people have sat there and gone, I can't continue to live anymore. On a sentence what was declared illegal and inhumane over 11 years ago.
85 people have killed themselves within the prison
people, yeah.
on IPP.
I'd have put a little bit more effort in, I won't be speaking to you today. It's only because I was probably scared and a bit cowardly about it. So you have to understand there's just no hope. And if you've got no hope, it's like, what's the point? What do I need to carry on for?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm not going to go and see my family tonight. I'm not going to go and see my family next year. Maybe never going to see my family again. I'm not going to get to taste a kebab. I'm not going to go and get to play football with my friends. So why do I need to carry on living? Because I don't want to live in this disgrace. And prisons are horrendous at the moment. Well, they always have been. They're just getting worse and worse at the moment. So I don't want to carry on living in this situation. And that's what the IPPs are. We are the biggest demographic per population of suicide cases. I dare to say there's going to be plenty more in the coming months and years just because of the way the system is at the moment.
I mean, Alice, how many are there in the system currently?
There's currently just under 3,000. And I think one of the particular problems that we're seeing at the moment is we've got more people who have been recalled on IPP sentences than were actually there for the initial sentence. I think the government is hoping to slowly but surely reduce the number of IPP prisoners, and they say they have their action plan in place. But if you have a system that is strict licence conditions, the sort of terms and conditions that somebody who's been released in prison needs to abide by. So if it was an offence, for example, involving children, they wouldn't be allowed within certain parameters of a school, for example. They are strict for good reason because they're obviously trying to make sure the public are protected. But I think it is without question that the IPP prisoners, I think, suffer disproportionately on release because they are on licence indefinitely. Now, it's 10 years before they can apply to have their licence cancelled. This is something that the government have looked at, and we have heard from the Ministry of Justice that they are looking to halve that period.
So, Anthony, you had a minimum term, 15 months, ended up spending 16 years. And at the point at which you leave prison, and you've been in and out, and we'll talk about that in a second, but the point at which you leave prison, you have a decade. You have a decade in which you could go straight back to prison.
Yeah, so
for the most minor of infractions.
It starts a decade from your first release date. Mm-hmm. So my first release date was 2017. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I'm entitled to apply for my licence conditions to be looked at 2027. I have got just over 3 years before I can apply.
Still, it's an awful lot of time.
Well, it's an 18-month process too when it gets looked at. It's not an easy process, and they can say no.
But you've been in and out, so explain what went on there and why.
I was released initially in 2017. In the area I was in, there was a spate of robberies going on. My name got chucked into it without any evidence whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Not something that even fitted me, MO, for want of a better word. I was recalled without any justification whatsoever. They actually got the lad who did it. He's living on the same wing as me. And that should have been me released immediately, which we were pushing for from this list. I had to do another 9 months in prison for parole board released me. To be fair to the judge, when I sat on the board, he's like, get this man out of jail now. The second one, so when an Irish convict comes out of prison, they have to go into what's called approved premises, like bail hostels. I turned up 4 hours late to my appointment. Silly. Yeah, of course it was. I broke a licence condition. Did it warrant me going back to prison? I don't think so.
Other people on not on IPPs who breached their licence conditions in that way would have gone back to prison on that, wouldn't they?
You usually get a couple of warnings.
Okay.
So I know I've lived in AP several times, and you are given several warnings because they have to give you a written one, then it's a final one, then it's a recall. So I got put back in custody for another 9 months, and then the final recall, I was out with some Christian friends. My faith's a huge part of my life now in Manchester, and 2 guys robbed me, took my phone and wallet. I attempted to fight them back, all on CCTV. I got a 28-day public order out for it. I went back to jail for 3 years and got released February this year.
And I suppose, Alice, as you've been looking into this in more depth, this isn't the only time that you're hearing stories like Anthony's.
I think what's been quite heartbreaking, really, when speaking to the families, is not a single person I've spoken to has said that their relative, their loved one, shouldn't have gone to prison. It's just this open-ended nature that clearly the government had concerns with, and that's why it was abolished. I spoke with one woman whose brother has been in solitary confinement for years, and then, unsurprisingly, I think perhaps act out. And to be fair, my understanding from when I've spoken with sources of mine at the parole board, they say this is really difficult because, you know, when someone comes forward and they have to assess an individual, whether it's an IPP or otherwise, if they have been frustrated and they have got mental health problems and they've kicked the door or they've done this or got into fights, that evidence is presented in front of them. They have to make a judgment about that, and they have to make a judgment about that, about what is safe for the public. And that is an incredibly hard decision to make. So I do think the parole board are in a very difficult decision when it comes to this. And crucially, they weren't the ones that brought this sentence in. They are simply abiding by the sentence that is now being abolished.
Can I just come in on that, sorry? I can speak from personal experience and from the people I was around. When we started to realise what this thing was about, we all shifted into gear. A lot of us got into gear and starting to work on ourselves and get the courses done. So they got to a position where they was ready for release, or they was ready to try and prove themselves for release. Rejection for whatever reasons, sometimes generally no fault of their own. Parole board was then rejecting them because of the mental health complications of what they'd suffered from the IPP.
It's a vicious circle.
I just want to give a quick 30 seconds about a guy who pinched a push bike at 17, got a 15-month IPP. He's been in 17 straight years without release. He got sectioned this week. And it breaks my heart to think about stuff like that. You know, a 17-year-old child who's now spent half of his life in prison, and is now been sectioned because of like the effect that, you know, that the IPP's had on him.
Alice, what is changing about this? Because surely natural justice, if nothing else, demands that the system is altered.
That's certainly what the Justice Select Committee would want, and they've looked at all the evidence of this, and that was their conclusions last year, was that resentencing should happen. And if we look at when someone gets into the position of Justice Secretary, they are having to consider what is popular with the public. And unfortunately, when it comes to these sorts of issues, a lot of people, I mean, even today when I've looked at the comments beneath this story today, and sadly, people are overwhelmingly negative, really, when it comes to anything to do with prisons.
Well, there aren't that many votes in criminals, I'm afraid, unfortunately. And whilst we all want a prison system to do what it says on the tin, to punish, but also to rehabilitate, ultimately, aren't the public happier not knowing what goes on behind those closed doors?
I always say that's fine. That's I get why the public are like that. I've got family members what are like thinking like that. These people are going to get released onto the streets one day. Yeah. You know, the punishment's getting removed from society. The rehabilitation process should then be part of what happens in custody. There's 65 natural lifers in this who will never be released, all life terms in this country. There's 90,000 people in prison at the moment. That's 90,000 people are going to get released onto the streets.
Well, and then also, I mean, kind of the morality of the situation aside, there are financial implications with it as well. I mean, it costs in the UK to keep somebody in prison. It's about £50,000.
Anthony, I mean, released in February. How are you feeling about it all just now? I mean, I know because you showed me you're on the tag at the moment. I mean, you must be perpetually worried about going straight back in.
I did. I've got to a place now where I'm not, just because of the employment I've got. I've got a fantastic probation officer. What I can say about this latest recall, it hit me the hardest I've been hit in any part of the 16 years, but it also gave me that kick up the backside. And I've surrounded myself by fantastic people. My faith's central to me, so I've got a lot of Christians around me. I've got a great family. I've got a great partner and a great probation officer. My job's wonderful. So the onus is on me. But no, for the first several months, I mean, I used to take a bag into probation full of clothes just to make sure I didn't get caught short of the fear. going shopping when I first come out. It's, things what people find so trivial, going to Asda. I'd have panic attacks, I've had meltdowns, and I'm blessed that that's what my career is now, going into sort of helping people for the first 48 hours after custody. So I'm still restricted. I still can't go home and spend the night with my partner. 7 months after being out, I've still got a tag on my leg. There is still a lot of unnecessary restrictions on me, but I also understand why they're there, and I also understand that there's a process. I just think that process is a little bit slow at the moment.
Well, wishing you all the very best.
Thank you.
Great to have you both on. Time for a quick pause. In just a moment, however, I'll be speaking to a former prison governor turned academic about how we might possibly get this system under control. See you in a sec. We often hear lock them up and throw away the key, but the reality is that not every IPP prisoner fits neatly into that category. And since IPPs were done away with back in 2012, how can it be fair that, unlike practically every other prisoner, they just do not know when, or indeed if, they will be freed? Professor Ian Acheson is a former prison governor, former head of the Youth Justice Board, and also held a number of senior positions at the Home Office. Ian, great to have you and your expertise with us. We both know, and you know better than I, where we are in terms of capacity within prisons at the moment. You could free up 4 figures potentially of prison spaces that are desperately needed. So why is the government so reticent to do so?
The government said in 2012 that IPP as a sentence was indefensible. Now, we're 11 years on, and it's still indefensible. And these people are still languishing effectively in a legal limbo, despite all the kind of warm words from the Secretary of State for Justice. Very little prospect of them being able to advance out of the system because of the state the prison system is in. Now, we're entering an election cycle, and I guess there's a huge fear of demonstrating in some way to the public that we're going soft on crime from either of the big 2 parties who are going into this election, because crime is a big issue at the minute. But we've got people in a horrible situation, a Kafkaesque nightmare inside prisons, who are killing themselves because they've lost all hope in being just given a fair shot. That is morally wrong.
It sounds to me that you agree with the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, suggesting that this is a form of psychological torture. Wouldn't the way to sort this out be to reinstitute those rehabilitation programs that these IPP prisoners need in order to secure their release?
I mean, yes, that would be the obvious answer. The problem that we have is there is no regulatory control externally over prisons. So prisons can look at those recommendations and do absolutely nothing about them. And some of those prisons would say, we would really love to instigate these rehabilitation programs. We're barely keeping prisoners in soap. We're barely keeping prisoners alive. This is quite far down the list of priorities. We need proper accountability for correcting this great injustice and many other injustices, incidentally, that exist in prisons that are making them virtually impossible to run, that are giving us some of the worst reconviction rates across Europe.
As you say, the rates of reoffending, the rates of recidivism in this country are remarkable. So clearly the rehabilitative element of prison is just not taking place. But I wonder, just in general terms, are you against the principle of preventative detention? Is there a place for that in our criminal justice system?
Yes, I think there probably is, and I would use a specific and very narrow example of where we've got ideologically motivated offenders who intelligence suggests are very dangerous. Unfortunately, as you know, we've had a significant number of tragedies in this country where terrorist offenders in custody have been released and have gone on to harm or even murder members of the public. I'm thinking of Tutesigensi, who was so dangerous when he was released from custody because there was no way of stopping that release happening. He was being man-marked by armed police when he went on a knife rampage. I mean, that's a completely unacceptable way to manage risk.
Taking a step back, what is your general assessment of the state of prisons at the moment?
Well, I think the situation is very serious, but it's not yet out of control, and it is recoverable, in my opinion. We have significant numbers of prisons now that are effectively out of the control of the state. They've got severely under-resourced prison officers who are demoralised and who are assaulted at record-breaking rates. They're leaving. at a rate that is almost greater than that they're being recruited, because they're being put into an environment that is extremely hostile, where vocation doesn't exist. Basically, they're being turnkeys because prisoners are being locked up 23 hours a day in conditions which you would hesitate to put livestock in. And it's the frontline men and women who put on a uniform every day and go in to try to give some return on the north of 5 billion we're spending on imprisonment in this country. They're the people that need to be focused on and supported. They're not getting that focus and support at the moment.
Professor Ian Acheson, great to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
In response to Alice Porter's investigation, a spokesman for the Ministry of Justice said, "These offenders were deemed a serious risk to the public, and we make no apologies for putting public protection first by ensuring that each release is properly assessed by the parole board." That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.